Well, welcome to Good Friday. If I haven't had the chance to meet you, my name is Chris. I'm the lead pastor here at Hoboken Grace. And it's a dark moment, but as we walk into the night and as we look forward to the weekend, I have to tell you, I'm so excited about how we get to watch God work this weekend. And how we get to watch him work in the lives of those who know him, how we get to watch him work in the lives of those who are running from him, how we get to watch him work in so many different ways. We have 9 individuals who are going to be taking the step of baptism over the course of the weekend, which is going to be incredible. Some of you are here tonight and you need to join that number, and so you should talk to Anthony afterwards because you need to take that step as well. We're going to talk about that more as we move through the weekend. But as we come together tonight and before we move into Easter, I want for us to experience something that we talked about in our last series, because in the last series we saw as we moved through the book of Ephesians that together, collectively, as we're engaging this journey together, that we get to experience and we get to learn how wide and how deep and how significant God's love is. And tonight, I want for us to experience that. And maybe you're here tonight and you believe in that love, or maybe you're here tonight and you don't. You haven't experienced the reality of Good Friday. This is just kind of a nice thing that you do, which, to be honest, is a little bit sad, because it was really costly for that to be all that it becomes. But no matter where you are, I want for us to be able to just sit for a second and hopefully, as we move through the night, for God's love to become deeper, for it to become wider. And there are very few moments that help us understand that, like Good Friday. There are very few moments that bring that into perspective, like Good Friday. And so I want to take you to this moment, actually, before Jesus is arrested. And I just want us to walk through one passage in particular. It's a story that's captured by Matthew and Luke and also by Peter. Now, Peter's account isn't called, when you read through Scripture, isn't called Peter. It's not called the book of Peter. It's called Mark, because Mark was an individual who traveled with Peter. And as Peter shared his eyewitness account, Mark recorded that, and that's how we have Peter's account. And I want to take you specifically to his account of this moment. And Jesus has already had the Last Supper with his disciples, and he knows that he's about to be arrested. Judas is already doing his thing, and he's going to betray him. And so Jesus does what he does before every significant moment. He goes to pray. Which is why, as Anthony said, we've been doing that for the past 24 hours here as we prepare for the significance of this weekend. And he goes away to pray. And interestingly enough, as he goes away to pray, he brings his disciples along with him, and then he takes 3 of them in particular, and he brings them really into his conversation with the Father, which isn't always the case, and makes this moment a little bit unique because of the fact that oftentimes Jesus withdraws to pray, but the disciples aren't necessarily with him, and they don't necessarily get to see that conversation happen. But this time, Jesus very intentionally says, no, I want for you, specifically Peter, James, and John, I want for you to come with me, because he wants for them to actually experience the moment. Which tells us that it's significant, and that there's something that he wants for us to see and to experience in it. I'm going to read through the whole thing here really quickly, and then we're going to jump back through it. But it says this. It says, and they went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. And he took with him Peter, James, and John. So he brings the 3 along even further. He says, and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. And you see Jesus is experiencing this anguish, and it's not just a minor feeling. He says, my soul, the very core of who I am, is very sorrowful, even to death. It continues, it says, remain here and watch. And going a little further, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but you will. And he came and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Which ties back to a conversation that he had with Peter just a little bit earlier, where Peter's like, I'm never going to allow anything to happen to you. And then Jesus says, you, keep watch. And Peter falls asleep. Which, for those of you who have trouble falling asleep when you're praying, this should make you feel better, because you know even Jesus' disciples had that problem. Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is indeed willing, but the flesh is weak. And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And again he came and found them sleeping. For their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. And he came the third time and said to them, are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It is enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise. Let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. And so Jesus goes away to pray. He specifically brings his disciples with him. It is a little bit interesting to me that they're sleeping. Because they've never seen Jesus this way. And the one thing that I struggled with as I sat with the passage is, if you see Jesus like this, why isn't that enough to keep you awake? Like there's no other story where they see Jesus in anguish like this. There's no other story where they see, Jesus is he literally can't stand up. He's so overwhelmed with what's about to happen. And they still can't stay awake. As I read through it, I was just meditating on it. I thought about another passage where the opposite is true. There's another story where we find that Jesus is asleep and the disciples are freaking out. They're in a boat. We find the story again in Mark chapter 4, and it says this. It says, on that day when evening had come, he said to them, let us go across to the other side. And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. And other boats were with him, and a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. So they're in the middle of the storm. Interestingly enough, it says, but he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion, speaking about Jesus. And they woke him and said to him, teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? They wake him up. We're all going to die. And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, peace be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? And it struck me as I watched this moment where they couldn't stay awake. And then you contrast that with this other moment where Jesus was asleep and they were awake. And I thought about how many times in life the things that keep me up are things not really worth worrying about, but I often sleep through the most important moments. Because I'm focused on the wrong thing. And for all of us, we struggle with this because we're so focused on the physical. And if they were in physical danger, well, that was enough to keep the disciples awake. But when they were so blind to the spiritual reality of what was happening in Gethsemane, they couldn't stay awake. And I think it challenges us with what is it that really consumes us? What is it that we're worried about? And whether or not it keeps us awake that we live in a community where so many don't know who Christ is. What is it that really causes us to worry? What is it that really causes us to lose sleep? But as you go through this, I think there's a lot more that we can learn and that we can see in this, and I don't want us to miss it because Jesus obviously wanted us to see this moment. So let's just start from the beginning again. I want to break this down. It says, and they went to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. And he took with them Peter, James, and John and began to be greatly distressed, troubled. And he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Now, sometimes I'll read people's writings on this passage and they'll say, well, here in this moment, you really get to see the human side of Jesus. Here in this moment, you get to see the human experience of Jesus, but I don't think this is just the human experience of Jesus. As we talked about a couple of weeks ago, the reality is that, and the writer of Ephesians tells us that we can actually bring grief to God's Spirit. I think that you see that as Jesus is moving into this moment, it's not just his human side, but it's very much his divine side that is experiencing grief, sorrow. He says, I'm crushed at the soul level. This is more than just his human side. It continues, it says, remain here and watch. And going a little further, he fell on the ground. He couldn't even stand up and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Now, this is an interesting word. And I think he specifically wanted for the disciples to hear him use this phrase. Because this word Abba, it's no one would ever have used this word for God. Prior to Jesus, people didn't even call God Father, let alone use this word Abba, because Abba was a very intimate. It's a word that a toddler, it's a word that a child would use to address their father. So the equivalent of it might be in our culture, daddy. He's talking to him in this way, daddy. He's calling out to him, daddy. This incredible intimacy. And the amazing thing about it is not just that we see Jesus use this, but Paul actually, as he's writing to the church at Rome, says that as you step into a relationship with God, as you accept what Jesus did for you on that Good Friday and what he made possible with Easter, that you actually get to use this very same phrase. So he says this, he says, for you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received the spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. He says, you get to actually call out to him in the same way. And I love how Paul uses this in this moment where he's calling us to step into courage. He says, no, you are not going to be overwhelmed. You are not ones who are filled with fear, but you actually are ones who step out in courage. Well, what is it that gives you the courage? And I love how he does this because he brings us back to the garden. He says, no, it's your relationship with the Father that gives you that courage. And you get to have this relationship that you would not just call him Father, that you would not just call him Dad, but that you would call him Daddy. And sometimes I'll say this to people that we get to call God Daddy, and they'll say, well, I don't think that that's appropriate. Because it's not typically a word that you use when you grow up. Now, some of you still use it for your parents after you grow up, and the rest of us are like, what? But I remember being with my friend, and he picked up the phone, Daddy? And I was like, but it's really interesting to me because oftentimes people say, well, I feel like it is in some way disrespectful to God. I don't think that's actually what happens when you say the word Daddy. Some of you are really uncomfortable with that word. So just really quickly on the count of three, just say it with me. 1, 2, 3. There you go. All right. Some of you are like, man, I don't like saying that. I don't like other people to hear me saying that. Why? Because it's not that it's actually disrespectful to God. It's that it makes you feel childish. But this is another thing that Jesus taught us. Matthew 18, he says, and he said, I tell you the truth, unless you change and become like little children, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. Isn't it remarkable that in this moment, Jesus becomes like a child to his dad, to his daddy. He's crying out to him, Daddy, Daddy. And then, as I was processing through that, something hit me as a dad. If you're a parent here, you know this, and even if you're not, you're probably fairly aware of this. What hurts more, when you're in pain or when your child is in pain? What hurts more? So then let me ask you this. What's the Father's experience in this moment? We spend a lot of time, and rightfully so, on the Son's experience, but I don't think very many of us have stopped to ask, wait a second, what's the Father's experience? And we know from Scripture, even with the nation of Israel in different places, that God's heart is moved when he sees the pain of his people and the pain of his children. So let me ask you this. What was the Father's experience as his Son is crying out, Daddy? Daddy. But they decide, no. And it's clear in this moment the Father, even as he's watching his Son experience this, decides, no. We're going to bring them home. We're going to bring them home. And so it continues, and Jesus says this. He says, remove this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but what you will. And so he's in this exchange with his Father. And they know what's coming, which if you don't know this about the cross, it's so important. Jesus goes through, and a lot of times people focus on the beatings and people focus on the insults and all of the things that Jesus experiences on the cross. But that's not the most painful experience for him. When Jesus cries out on the cross, he cries out, my Father, why have you forsaken? It's the moment that he cries out. We don't actually see him cry out at any other time. The moment of extreme anguish is when he actually is alone for the first time. When his daddy's no longer there. When for the first time, he's without his daddy. And they're going through this anguish. They know what's coming. They know that that the Father is going to have to pour out his wrath on his Son on our behalf. And in this moment, Jesus says, if there's another way, and it's clear the Father says, no, we're going to bring them home. And so he says, not my will, but yours. And this is significant on multiple levels. Because one, it teaches us something really significant about love. And it teaches us something really significant about the way that we should love others. And Jesus actually demonstrates this for us. And this may be one of the reasons why he brings the three into it, because he wants them to see him live out what he's going to teach them to do. Because we live in a world where love is reciprocal, and so I'm going to love you because you love me, and as long as you do a good job loving me, then I'm going to love you back. But Jesus steps in, and God, the Father, steps in and says, we're going to turn that whole thing upside down, and so you're not going to love other people because of the fact that they deserve it. And you're not going to love other people because of the fact that they're good. You're not going to love other people because of the fact that they love you. You're actually going to love other people because of the fact that I've loved you. And the reason that you're going to love is because of your love for me. And it's in your response to me that you're going to love them. And I have this conversation with my kids all the time. And they'll come to me and they'll have hit their brother, which happens daily. And I say, you can't do that. And they'll say, but you should. And immediately it's what the other person did. Immediately it's about the other person. Well, you got to understand you have to understand then you don't understand the love of God. Don't talk to me about the other person, because we don't love anybody because of what they. It's never that. It's always because of what he. It's always because of the love that we've experienced from him. 1 John is so clear on this. It says we love because he loved us first. The whole reason, the whole driver behind it is because of the love that we have from him. It's the relationship that we have from him that motivates us, that moves us in love towards those around us. And so I'll say to my boys, and we should say this to ourselves all the time because we think this constantly. Yeah, but they, no, don't talk to me about them. Talk to me about your Father. And the reality that when we choose not to love, because God says, here's how you love me, you love them. When we choose not to love, we're not saying, well, they don't deserve it. What we're saying is, well, Dad, you don't deserve it. And what I love about this moment is that Jesus actually demonstrates this. And so, as they're having this conversation, Jesus doesn't say, no, I'm going to do it because of the fact that I just love them so much. No, he actually says, Father, I'm going to do it because I love you so much. Not my will, but yours. Father, I'm going to, and you see this phenomenal relationship that he has with the Father that's now being extended to us. And he says, no, Father, because of the relationship that I have with you, because of the love that I have for you, because I'm going to follow you into this. And he demonstrates for all of us what it means to love, and specifically what it means to love when it's really hard. Now I'm going to do it because I know the story of Good Friday. And I'm going to love my wife, I'm going to love my kids, I'm going to love my roommate, I'm going to love my coworkers because I know the story of Good Friday and I know the way that my dad has loved me. And he deserves for me to love you that way. And so they decide to execute the plan to bring us home. And this is so encouraging to me. And maybe it will be for you. I don't know. But this is so encouraging to me because we live in a world where everyone is obsessed with people feeling like loving us or us feeling like loving. But I love that in this moment, Jesus gives us this insight into what true love is. Because true love is not serving or acting in love or loving someone else or giving of yourself to someone else because you feel like loving. And Jesus demonstrates this because he, obviously, as he's moving through this, he's like, no, I feel, I'm overwhelmed, I'm crushed. True love is not serving when you feel like loving. No. True love is serving when you feel like running. When everything inside of you says, if there's any other way, Father, if there's any other... And this is so incredibly encouraging for me. Because sometimes in life I think, man, you know what? I went too far. You know what? I bet now God's going to give up on me. I bet now I've hurt God too much and he's not going to follow through with it. But what I love is that in this moment, in incredible anguish, even when Jesus is saying, man, everything inside of me wants to do, he still chose you. still chose you. In that moment, he still chose. No. We're going to go and bring them home. As it continues, I love how he ends the passage as well. It says, and he came and found them sleeping. He said to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Then again he went away and prayed the same words. Then he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy. And they did not know what to answer him. And he came the third time and said to them, are you still sleeping and taking your rest? And then he says this, it is enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. I love how he ends it. Because he comes to them and he says, okay, guys, the time for rest is over. Now it's time to show the world what true love is. Rise. Let us be going. And I think he speaks the same into every one of our lives. Okay. And what he does on Good Friday makes it possible for him to speak in every one of our lives and say, okay, now, rise. Now's the time to show the world what true love is. Now's the time. As we move through the rest of this evening, we're going to continue to celebrate. And I know you want to celebrate because you were singing. And we're going to continue to celebrate. But as we celebrate, you'll see that we have additional tables set up around the room because we want to move through the practice of communion tonight. And the practice of communion is where we go and remember the blood that was shed for us and the body that was broken for us. But it was, as you think about that, I want for you to move to that table and to think about that moment where as the Father and Son you see the Son crushed, my soul is crushed to the point of death. I want for you to think about that moment and the willingness of the Father and the Son to move through that moment and say, no, we're going to bring them home. They knew all of what it would entail. And they still chose you. So as we move through these next two songs, I want you to go to that table. And to celebrate and to remember. To be overwhelmed. That we would be crushed in our soul with his love. Isn't it amazing that he took the soul-crushing punishment that we deserved so that we could be overwhelmed and crushed with his love? And may you, as you go to that table, may you be crushed with his love. Overwhelmed. With the fact that he chose. Knowing all that it would entail, that he chose to give his life for you. Father, I can't begin to even fathom the full reality of that moment. I can't begin to even fathom what it was like for you as your son was calling out to you Daddy. I can't begin to fathom the love that would move through that moment. The love that would move through that moment to say, no, 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 no. We're going to bring them home. I pray for everyone here that tonight they would awaken to the reality of that love. That they would not just know about it, but that they would feel it. That your love would grow wider and deeper as we remember what you've done for us. In Jesus' name.